When the first bulldozers arrived, I didn't think much of it. The old pasture had been empty for years, and rumor around town was that a new housing development was going in. I didn't mind progress happens. What I did mind, however, was when those same bulldozers started digging into land I knew for a fact belonged to me. My grandfather had bought that parcel back in the 1950s, a stretch of roughly 20 acres on the north side of town. When he passed, the property was divided among the family, and I ended up with about 7 acres of it. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I kept the taxes paid, the boundaries marked, and the deed tucked away safely in my filing cabinet. There was never any dispute until that day. At first, I assumed it was a simple mistake. Construction crews sometimes misread surveys or push a little past the line to make room for equipment. So I walked over to the site and found the foreman. He was a big guy, sunburned and wearing a reflective vest, shouting orders over the roar of an excavator. When I managed to get his attention, I asked him who gave permission to work past the fence line. He looked confused for a second, then shrugged and said, "The HOA owns all this land now. Talk to them." That was the first time I heard the 3 letters that would soon become the center of my life: H.O.A. I asked to speak to whoever was in charge, and the next day a woman named Patricia showed up. She was the president of the new Brookstone Meadows Homeowners Association, and she carried herself like she owned the world. She wore expensive sunglasses, carried a leather binder, and smiled the way people do when they're about to say something condescending. "I understand there's been some confusion," she said sweetly. "This property is part of our development. We purchased it last year from the county." I raised an eyebrow. "That's funny," I said, "because I've owned this land for over a decade." Her smile faltered for just a second before she regained her composure. "I think you're mistaken. The county records show it as part of our plot." I invited her to walk the line with me. The original boundary markers were still there, metal stakes my grandfather had placed himself, backed up by GPS coordinates on the most recent survey. We walked past the markers, and I pointed to one sticking out of the dirt near a half-built foundation. "That's my side," I said. "Everything from here to the creek belongs to me." She frowned, took out her phone, and made a call. A few minutes later, 2 men in suits arrived, clearly developers or HOA board members. One of them introduced himself as Greg, vice president of the HOA board. "Look," he said, "we've got the deed, the permits, everything in order. If there's a mistake, it's on the county's end. But I promise you, we own this land now." They were confident, too confident. I could tell they genuinely believed what they were saying, which meant one of 2 things: either the county messed up, or the HOA was bluffing. I told them calmly that I'd look into it and walked away. That evening, I pulled out my file cabinet and found the old deed. The yellowing paper still bore my grandfather's signature, notarized and stamped. Then I logged into the county assessor's website and checked the parcel map. To my shock, the digital records now showed the land as part of the Brookstone Meadows subdivision. Somewhere along the line, the title transfer had been altered. But I hadn't sold it, gifted it, or signed anything. The next day, I went down to the county clerk's office with the original deed in hand. The clerk, an older man named Howard, looked at the documents and frowned. "That's strange," he said. "According to our database, this land was sold in a bulk transfer 3 years ago to the developer." I asked to see the paperwork, and he printed it out. The supposed transfer document had a signature that vaguely resembled mine, but it wasn't mine. It wasn't even close. Someone had forged it? Howard's face turned serious when I pointed it out. You might want to talk to a lawyer, he said. If this is a fraudulent transfer, it's a big deal. So I did. I met with a local real estate attorney named Mason, a sharp, no-nonsense guy who dealt with property disputes before. He looked over everything: the deed, the parcel map, the fake signature, and let out a low whistle. They built on your land, he said flatly. This isn't a minor error. This is full-blown title fraud. The county will have to investigate, and the HOA will be in serious trouble once this hits court. He leaned back in his chair. Now, the question is, do you want to stop construction immediately or let them dig their own hole? That question stayed with me. I could have filed an injunction right then and there, halted the entire project, and watched them scramble. But something in me wanted to wait. Let them build their fancy houses, pave their roads, sell their lots. The deeper they went, the harder they'd fall when the truth came out. So I told Mason, let's give it some time. I want everything documented first. He raised an eyebrow but agreed. Over the next several months, I watched as the land transformed. They cleared trees, poured concrete, and built houses, dozens of them. Every time I drove by, I took photos and videos, cataloging each stage of construction. Neighbors who bought early started moving in, completely unaware that their dream home sat on land that wasn't legally theirs. I felt a mix of anger and amusement watching it unfold. The arrogance of that HOA president still echoed in my mind. You can't own what's already ours. Oh, but I did own it. And one day, she'd see just how wrong she'd been. Word started spreading that the new neighborhood was almost complete. The HOA was hosting meetings, advertising more lots, and bragging about how successful the development had been. I even received a flyer in my mailbox inviting me to an open house. That was the moment I knew they had no idea what was coming. The houses were finished, the landscaping was perfect, and the residents were settled in. 96 homes, all sitting squarely on property that still belonged to me. One afternoon, I stopped by the site pretending to be a curious local. I chatted casually with one of the workers and asked who the developer was. When he mentioned the same company tied to the fraudulent deed, my plan solidified. I thanked him, drove home, and opened a new file on my computer labeled Brookstone Case. Inside, I placed copies of every photo, every video, every letter, and every record I had. I even made backups on a flash drive, just in case. I wasn't in a rush anymore. I could wait. The longer they believed they were in control, the more dramatic the fall would be when the truth finally surfaced. By the end of the year, the neighborhood was complete. Families decorated their porches for the holidays, kids played in driveways, and the HOA proudly announced that all lots were sold. Patricia, the president, even gave an interview to the local paper, calling it a symbol of community growth. I clipped that article and added it to my file. It was the perfect piece of irony. They thought they owned everything, but all they had done was build their empire on my foundation. So I waited, patient as ever, because I knew that when the time came, I wouldn't need bulldozers or arguments or threats. I'd only need one piece of paper. The original deed, the one my grandfather signed, the one with my name on it, the one that would bring their entire house of cards crashing down in court. Weeks turned into months, and I watched from a distance as the construction continued across my land. Every morning, I'd drive past the site on my way to town, and each time there were more houses, more trucks, more workers. The noise of saws and hammers carried across the creek like a reminder that the people in charge thought they could do whatever they wanted. I didn't interfere. I didn't confront them again. Instead, I observed, recorded, and waited. My lawyer Mason had advised me to stay quiet until we had everything we needed, proof beyond argument that the land they were building on was still legally mine. So that's exactly what I did. I kept my calm while the HOA and their developers unknowingly dug themselves deeper into a hole they wouldn't be able to climb out of. By late spring, half the houses were finished. Shiny new roofs, manicured lawns, and even fancy mailboxes with the Brookstone Meadows logo engraved on them. They were proud of what they built, but every time I saw it, all I could think was how much more expensive their mistake was becoming. The county records still hadn't been corrected, and the fraudulent deed remained in their system. Mason told me it would take time for the investigation to unfold, but he assured me that the evidence we had was airtight. Once this hits court, he said one afternoon, they're done. They built on land that never belonged to them. The law is on your side. Still, the waiting tested my patience. I get letters in the mail from the HOA inviting me to join their community events. The irony was almost too much to handle. They were so confident, so sure that everything they had built belonged to them. One afternoon, I even received a notice about boundary maintenance fees. I laughed out loud reading it. They were charging me to maintain my own land. I didn't bother responding. Let them think they were winning. The deeper their arrogance ran, the harder the impact would be when the truth surfaced. One weekend, I parked my truck at the edge of the property and took a long walk through the area. The sun was setting, and the air smelled of fresh paint and cut wood. Children's bikes leaned against fences, and new homeowners chatted over backyard grills. None of them had any idea that their dream neighborhood sat on land that wasn't theirs. I didn't blame them, they were just buyers. The real villains were the people who had forged documents, twisted boundaries, and ignored warnings. As I walked, I noticed that the construction had crossed well past my original markers. The developers hadn't just encroached, they had completely erased the old lines, paving over them as if history didn't matter. Near the northern edge of the property, I found something that made me stop. One of my grandfather's old fence posts was still standing, half buried under a new concrete sidewalk. The top of the post had his initials carved into it, E.C. for Edward Carter. I ran my hand over the rough wood, still solid after decades. It was a piece of proof, a physical reminder of who this land truly belonged to. I took a picture and added it to my growing folder of evidence. By midsummer, all 96 houses were complete. The HOA held a big ribbon-cutting ceremony, complete with a banner, music, and speeches. I didn't attend, but I watched from my truck parked across the road. Patricia, the HOA president, stood at the front in her designer suit, beaming for the cameras as she cut the ribbon. She gave a speech about community pride and ownership. Every word made me smirk. Ownership. That was the word that would haunt her soon enough. A week later, Mason called me with news. The county's review came through, he said. They confirmed that the transfer 3 years ago was fraudulent. The signature doesn't match any official records, and there's no legitimate sale on file. Legally, the land is still yours. I felt a rush of relief, mixed with a sense of quiet triumph. So what happens next, I asked. He paused for a moment. Now, we let them finish what they started, then we go to court. Once they've put everything in writing, the homes, the HOA structure, the property values, it'll all be evidence. You'll own every inch they built on. That's exactly what I plan to do. I waited until the HOA had sold all 96 homes. Once the final sale closed, Mason filed the paperwork. The lawsuit named the developer, the HOA, and the county as co-defendants in a property fraud and encroachment case. The claim was simple: they built nearly an entire neighborhood on private land that they never purchased. I had the original deed, photographs of the boundary markers, proof of forgery, and the county's own admission of error. The moment the summons hit their desk, I knew the storm was coming. The first to call was Patricia. Her tone was no longer condescending, it was panicked. "There must be some mistake," she said over the phone. "This can't be right. We bought this property legally." I told her calmly, "Then you won't have any problem proving that in court." There was silence on the other end before she said, "If this is true, you're going to destroy dozens of families' homes." I replied, "I didn't destroy anything. I just didn't let you steal what wasn't yours." She hung up without another word. A few days later, news spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Homeowners were furious. Some showed up at my driveway, demanding answers. I told them the truth: I wasn't after their homes. I was after accountability. The HOA and the developer had done this, not them. Still, the panic was spreading, and I could see it in their faces. Mortgage lenders started calling too. They wanted to know why a third of the subdivision's land titles were under dispute. It was chaos, and all I had done was let the truth come to light. Meanwhile, Mason was preparing for court. He told me to keep calm and let the process play out. "They'll try to settle before it goes to trial," he said. "They know they don't stand a chance once you show that deed." He was right. Within 2 weeks, the developer's lawyer contacted us, offering to negotiate compensation to avoid a public trial. I told Mason to reject the first offer. I wanted this to go as far as it could. I wanted everyone in that courtroom to hear exactly how reckless and arrogant the HOA had been. At night, I'd sit on my porch looking toward the rows of identical houses glowing under the streetlights. It was almost surreal, an entire neighborhood built on stolen ground. I thought about my grandfather, about how he'd worked this land by hand, planting trees and mending fences long before the HOA ever existed. He'd always said, "People who don't respect the land shouldn't own it." I realized how right he was. These people hadn't respected anything: not history, not honesty, not ownership. By the time the court date arrived, I felt no anger, just calm resolve. They'd built their dream neighborhood right on top of my land, confident that no one would ever notice or fight back, but I had noticed. I'd been watching from the beginning. And now, everything they'd taken for granted was about to be turned upside down. Mason told me the developers were bringing their entire legal team, but he smiled when he said it. "They can bring an army," he said. "It won't change the facts." As I gathered my documents the night before the hearing, I glanced at the old deed one last time. The paper was fragile, the ink faded, but it still carried weight. The signature, the notary seal, the dates, all proof of the truth they thought they could bury. They had built their dream homes on my property line, and now I was about to pull the ground right out from under them. The courtroom was packed the morning of the hearing. Developers in crisp suits, HOA board members whispering nervously, homeowners sitting in the gallery with anxious faces. Everyone was there to see what would happen. I walked in quietly with my lawyer Mason, carrying the same old folder I'd been keeping since the day the bulldozers rolled onto my land. Inside it was everything: photos, documents, maps, and most importantly, the original deed with my grandfather's signature. I wasn't nervous. ID waited too long for this moment. The judge took her seat, and the chatter faded to silence. The case was officially called, Carter vs. Brookstone Development, Brookstone Meadows HOA, and the County of Fairview. That single sentence made the entire room hold its breath. The HOA's attorney started first, painting a picture of a misunderstanding. He claimed that the development company had purchased the land in good faith, that all documentation had been approved by the county, and that the issue was just a clerical error. He spoke with the confidence of someone used to getting his way, using big legal terms to make the situation sound minor. But I noticed how often he avoided eye contact with me. Even he knew, deep down, that this was more than a paperwork mix-up. Mason let him finish without interrupting, then stood up slowly and walked to the front. "Your Honor," he began, "this isn't a case of misunderstanding. It's a case of fraud and arrogance. My client's property was stolen on paper, and 96 homes were built on land he never sold." He handed the judge a binder of evidence deeds, tax records, signatures, and the county's own admission of error. The judge flipped through it carefully, her brow furrowing as she read. The room grew tense. Mason continued, "We're not talking about an empty field here. We're talking about homes, families, an entire subdivision built on false ownership claims. The defendants were warned about the boundary line and ignored it. They relied on a fraudulent transfer to justify their actions. And today, we're here to set that right." When it was my turn to take the stand, I spoke plainly. I told the story from the beginning, how ID approached the foreman, how the HOA president dismissed me, how I found my grandfather's original deed, and how the county clerk confirmed the fraud. The courtroom was quiet except for the sound of my voice. Every time I mentioned proof, Mason placed another document in front of the judge. When I talked about the old fence post with my grandfather's initials still carved into it, even a few of the homeowners looked down at their hands, realizing what that symbolized. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Mason reached into my folder and pulled out the original deed. The old paper was yellowed with age but still perfectly legible. He placed it on the judge's desk and said, "This is the true and lawful deed to the land on which Brookstone Meadows was built. Dated 1956, recorded and notarized, and never transferred since. This is ownership in its purest form." The HOA attorney immediately objected, claiming there must be an error, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. She examined the document closely, comparing it with the county's digital record. Then she looked up and said, "This signature does not match the one on the transfer filed 3 years ago." The room went still. You could almost hear the collective realization sinking in. The judge asked the county representative to approach. A nervous-looking man stepped forward with a laptop and a folder. "Mr. Jennings," she said, "please explain how this property was transferred without a legitimate signature." The man cleared his throat. "Your Honor, after internal review, the county determined that the transfer was processed under a fraudulent document. It appears someone within the developer's filing office submitted it without verification. The land, by law, still belongs to Mr. Carter." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The HOA attorney tried to speak again, but the judge cut him off. "Sit down, counsel," she said firmly. For a moment, I just sat there, watching the realization spread across their faces. Patricia, the HOA president, looked pale. The developers exchanged nervous glances, whispering furiously to each other. Homeowners in the back began murmuring, some in shock, others in anger. One man stood up and shouted, "Does this mean our houses aren't ours?" The judge had to gavel for silence. "Order in the court," she said sharply. When the noise finally settled, she turned to Mason and said, "Mr. Carter, what relief are you seeking?" Mason stood beside me and replied clearly, "Full recognition of property ownership, compensation for trespass and damage, and an immediate injunction against the HOA's continued occupation without legal agreement." The developer's lawyer tried one last time to minimize the damage, suggesting a settlement and claiming that forcing a neighborhood off the land would be cruel. But Mason countered with precision. They had every opportunity to verify ownership before construction. Instead, they chose arrogance over diligence. My client isn't asking to destroy homes. He is asking for justice. And justice means holding those responsible accountable. The judge nodded slowly and said, "I've seen enough." She reviewed the evidence once more and delivered her ruling right then and there. Based on the documents presented and testimony heard, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Carter. The land on which the subdivision known as Brookstone Meadows was constructed remains under his legal ownership. The developers and HOA acted without proper title and are liable for damages. The county is ordered to correct its records immediately. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the sound of papers shuffling and whispered curses filled the room. The ruling hit the HOA like a thunderclap. Their entire foundation literally and figuratively had been built on stolen ground. Patricia tried to approach me afterward, her voice trembling. "Please," she said, "you can't just take this away from them. Families live there." I looked her in the eye and said quietly, "You should have thought about families before you ignored the truth." I didn't gloat, didn't yell, didn't smile. I just walked out of that courtroom knowing that I had finally restored what was rightfully mine. In the weeks that followed, chaos erupted in the neighborhood. The news spread fast, headlines in local papers, coverage on TV, even interviews about the HOA that built on stolen land. Some homeowners were angry with me, others with the HOA. But the ones who truly understood came to me privately, apologizing for what had happened. I told them I wasn't after their homes, I was after accountability. The developers eventually offered a massive settlement to lease the land legally, transferring profits and damages directly to me. Mason said it was poetic justice. They ended up paying me to keep living on the property I'd owned all along. One evening, months later, I drove by Brookstone Meadows. The sun was setting, and the houses looked peaceful under the golden light. The road signs still bore the same name, but now everyone in that neighborhood knew the truth of where they stood. I stopped by the creek and got out of my truck, standing where my grandfather's fence once stood. The air was quiet, the water calm. In my hand, I held a copy of the court order confirming my ownership. It felt heavy not because of the paper, but because of everything it represented. They had built their dream neighborhood on my land, laughed in my face, and told me I couldn't own what was theirs. But in the end, when I pulled out that old deed in court, all their arrogance crumbled. I didn't need revenge or headlines. I already had everything I wanted: the truth, the land, and the peace of knowing that no one would ever try to take it from me again.